Hey y'all, so I'm out today because I'm at a conference, and so we're gonna do our day 3 Pear Deck kind of student pace. So you get to work at the whole thing at your own pace. But I am going to record this video so that I can guide you through it, and it's still gonna be the same thing where we do the information. You get to use your note sheet to help you out with the practice problems, and then there's an exit ticket at the very end. So let me present this. So day 3 of the STAAR countdown today is on evolution and evolution theory and evidence of evolution. And we talked about this for, we talked about this for quite a bit when we actually went over the unit, but it's been a while. So I did want to do a pretty good refresher. Before you do anything, make sure that you go into Google Classroom and you open up today's reference sheet. You can also click on the link inside of your Pear Deck once you've opened it. So you should have your Pear Deck open to work while you're watching this video. You should have your note sheet open, and you should not have your exit ticket open yet. You will do that after you finish the Pear Deck. Okay? At the end of this lesson, you should be able to define common ancestry for me and describe how the fossil record, biogeography, and homologies can provide evidence of common ancestry among organisms. Before we get started, please go ahead and write for me, what is something that you believe to be true about evolution? You can write about evolution, you can write about natural selection, monkeys, DNA, Charles Darwin, religion, church, survival of the fittest, etc. Any of these are viable options, but I'm gonna ask that you pause this video and then go ahead on this screen in your Pear Deck, write your response to this question. All right, moving on. So what is evolution? Technically, it's a theory, right? There's no way for us to go back in time and say that this is a law or a fact, but it is a good theory that has withstood a lot of time and evidence that helps us answer a lot of questions about where we came from, where life came from, how life started, all that good stuff. So it is a theory that predicts how after life began, whatever way it began, it tells us, a good idea of how organisms became diverse to the point where we have so many different kinds of life forms now that exist on Earth. So basically, the order goes that the organisms are born or created. Time will pass, the environment will change naturally. Some characteristics of the organisms will be more favorable for survival, some will be less favorable for survival. And you know what happens to those organisms, right? They die, so they can't reproduce. So the ones that best fit are going to reproduce. And over time, you either get species that die off, species that go extinct, new species, maybe multiple new species, right? That all happens because some organisms survive better than others. And so evolution does not explain for us how life began, right? Evolution is simply a theory that tells us how one species eventually gets different and more different over time, and it eventually maybe becomes two species, which happens over and over and over and over again over time until we have the millions of species that we see on Earth today. So many people are religious and believe in evolutionary theory due to the fact that there's a lot of evidence. So there's not like a sort of dichotomy where you can't believe in evolution just because you're religious. I just want to be very clear about that, right? You can understand how evolutionary theory works, and you can also believe in God. Those two are things that do not conflict with each other. So how do we know that the process of evolution is real? Well, there's a lot of evidence that we have found in the history of the Earth, literally through digging through layers of the stone and the soil. And we have the fossil record, we have biogeography, we have homologous structures, we have DNA similarities, and we have embryology all as evidence. So let's go through the evidences that evolution is occurring. The first one that we want to talk about is the fossil record. You probably remember this when we talked about how newer rocks are closer to the surface of the Earth, and then older layers or older rocks are going to be lower down, closer to the core of the Earth. And so fossils can show how organisms have changed over time when you look at the fossils through different layers from lowest layer to highest layer. And if you can find similar kinds of fossils that are preserved of similar organisms, you can see the little changes that are happening throughout the years as they are dying and being preserved. We can also talk about biogeography, which kind of goes back to, Pangea, where we had all of the continents actually clumped together before they all separated. And we can see how organisms were distributed across Pangea versus when Pangea started splitting apart into the continental distribution that we now know, and looking at how organisms, descendants from the past, now descended, have adapted to different environments and look slightly different, but might have similar overall structures. For example, the descendant of the emu, the ostrich, and the cassowary, now they look really different from each other, but they're overall large birds that are really, really good at running and have high running speeds and have giant legs and giant statures, unlike all of the other kinds of birds that we really know about. And they're spread across all the southern continents. So that kind of shows us where they were probably close together in Pangea. So again, species that live in the same area are probably more closely related, and Pangea explains why organisms that live on the coasts of a lot of these continents are very similar to each other, even after all the years that have passed since Pangea no longer exists. Homologous structures are a great evidence for evolution because you're looking at the internal bone structures of organisms, and a lot of the times they have the same basic pieces with different purposes. So if you look here in the example, we have a human arm, a bat wing, a frog arm, a porpoise, a fin, and a horse leg. And the bones inside are actually really similar. They're color-coded, right? They all have a humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpals, and phalanges. But their purposes are all different, right? Because humans use their arms to grab and reach and throw, bats use them to fly, frogs and porpoises to swim, but differently, and then horses to run. So looking at the internal structure tells us that at some point there was an ancestor that grew these internal structures, and these internal structures, like these bones, are really successful as a physical structure. So the genes that have been, developed to grow these structures have been passed down, even though they've been slightly altered over time to eventually cause different purposes. Analogous structures are the same functions but different structures. So, for example, a bird's wing versus a dragonfly's wing. They're both used for flying, but the internal structure is very different. Whereas birds have bones, they have muscle, they have skin, they have feathers, and the insect's wings are just made out of exoskeleton. These are not evidence of common ancestors, but the previous example for homologous structures are strong evidences for common ancestors or a recent common ancestor, meaning that these species diverged or branched or separated from each other a lot more recently than, for example, these two. We still know, I still want to be clear, we still know that the dragonfly and the bird are technically related by a common ancestor. It's just a lot further back because they're so physically different now. Here are some more examples, right? Same shape and number of bones would be a homologous structure having the same structure. So we would assume that they have a recent or a more recent common ancestor. But if you're looking at, for example, wings for flight, they're analogous. We would not assume that they have a recent common ancestor, although we do have to be clear that they do have a common ancestor. It's just way, way, way far back in time. Embryology is the last example. If we look at these embryos, can you tell me off the top of your head which ones of these is a fish, a human, a turtle, a salamander, or a pig? I want you to make a guess, right? Which letter do you think is a fish? Which letter do you think represents a human, turtle, salamander, and pig? So pause and go ahead and try your best. It's okay if you get it wrong. So when we actually look at them, you can see in the background we have the fish, the salamander, tortoise, chick, pig, calf, rabbit, human. Early in development, they all look really, really, really similar. But when they're born, they all look pretty different, right? We know that, right? A baby human looks really different from a freshly hatched tortoise. But this tells us that their DNA for their developmental phases early on in life are all really similar in their embryos because it's a successful way to develop. If you develop your eyes, your brain, your spine first, you're probably going to have a successful offspring that survives and then is able to go and reproduce on its own to make the next generation. So these are traits that are shared and they serve as evidence for common ancestry because there was an ancestor at some point in history that had these traits that caused the development to occur in this order that passed it down because it was successful. So now a lot of organisms develop in this order, but that does make it really hard to tell us apart from the very beginning when we are embryos. When we look at DNA sequences too, you can compare organisms and just straight up compare them and say, hey, you have a lot of DNA in common, right? Because your percentage that you share is really high. So that means that you're probably pretty closely related. And the closer related you are to another organism or another species, the more recent your common ancestor is. It's the same way that you're more closely related to your sister or your brother when comparing to your cousin, right? The branching is further back or further away from you. It goes back to the aunts and the uncles. It goes back to a different generation versus when it's just you and your sister or you and your brother, it's just your parents. It's a close branching. So again, if you have similar DNA sequences, then that means that you're more closely related and you have a more recent common ancestor if you're comparing different species. So as a recap, here's a page that explains the evidence that evolution is constantly occurring, and it's still occurring even to this day, especially in the wild. It doesn't impact us as much because we have technology and medicine, but to animals that are out in the wild, to plants, to insects, all those good things, they're all being impacted by evolution. So let's talk about some mechanisms that can cause evolution. Natural selection is a good one, right? First off, every species in a population has variation. No species is perfectly identical throughout the entire set of all the animals that belong to that species. So because there's variation or differences, some organisms are going to be better when there's competition for food or for living space or for water or for mates. The better adapted members, or the ones that are better able to survive, are going to be able to then also reproduce, because if you don't survive, you ain't having no babies, right? If you survive, you reproduce, and when you reproduce, your genes are the ones getting passed on. So the ones that fit or are best adapted to the environment are the ones that are going to get passed down. And when they get passed down, then the next generation looks more similar to what you look like or what you were like because you survived and reproduced. A mutation is going to be able to create the variation that we needed at the very beginning, right? I said there's variation, but variation doesn't just, it doesn't just happen innately. It has to occur by chance through mutations. And sometimes mutations are bad, right? When we think about mutations, we generally think about pretty bad things like causing death, causing disfigurement. But most mutations that occur are either have no effect or they're potentially beneficial, right? Because if the environment changes, then any differences that you have could all of a sudden increase your chances of surviving in the environment being different. So mutations will create variation. Unfavorable mutations, obviously, will get knocked out because they're not going to help your survival. And then reproduction and mutation will happen again, each generation, each round, each time new cells are created, each time new reproductive gamete cells are created. And then favorable mutations are more likely to survive and reproduce and expand how much of the population they cover. Gene flow, aka migration, is another way that evolution can be kind of pushed towards one direction or the other. So gene flow is the random movement of organisms from one population to another, and it brings new genes into a population, or it can also remove genes from a population. So if an individual leaves one population to join another one, they're taking their genes with them, and then they will go and intermingle and mate throughout each generation with that new population that they're in. And so that new population gets a lot more variation just from that one organism maybe migrating over. But the other population that it left loses gene variation because whatever genes you had with you, you took it when you left. The bottleneck effect is another way that evolution occurs, and it's a kind of genetic drift where an event, perhaps a natural disaster, perhaps a human disaster, drastically reduces the size of a population and causes some genes to be lost forever. And the survivors from that event have to repopulate the population. Now, when you look at the original population, you can see a lot of oranges, a couple greens, a lot of reds, but then we call it a bottleneck because when you pour out of a little bottleneck, only a few or a small amount comes out at a time. And those are the survivors. Everybody else gets chucked in the bin. Everybody else doesn't make it. And so the surviving population then has to repopulate, and you can see based on the survivors, just by chance, the makeup of the population of their genes is now very different looking. There's a lot more reds, there's not as much oranges. There's still a pretty decent amount of greens, right? And then the founder's effect is kind of, when you found a new population, when you found a new location, it's going to be you moving to that location and then populating that location. So it's another kind of genetic drift. It's where one or a few individuals leave the original population to start their own colony. And this new population has a totally different set of circumstances. It affects the gene pool, and whoever migrated there is whatever set gene pool you're starting off with before they then go ahead and mate and reproduce offspring. They only have whatever genes they brought with them, right? So the newly founded population doesn't always represent the genetic diversity that the original big population occurred or had, So over here, for example, there's greens, but turns out only the reds moved into the new colony. So probably the rest of the offspring for future generations are all going to be red offspring. Geographic isolation can also cause speciation, which is another part of evolution, where if you're physically separated from another group, even though you originally were the same species, over time, if your environments are different, your species or your group is going to be better suited or better adapted to your environment. And then if I were to plop the snail from the bottom back over to the snails at the top, they might not even recognize each other anymore. And they probably wouldn't be suited to be surviving in that environment, and they would die really easily. So geographic isolation physically separates organisms that used to be in the same group into different roles or different niches, and that causes speciation. And then reproductive isolation causes two organisms to not be able to mate anymore, two populations to not be able to mate with each other anymore and produce viable or fertile offspring. And that means that they are officially two separate species. Go ahead and try out this problem now after we reviewed all this information. The question asks, which condition is essential for natural selection to result in a new species? F says unlimited resources, G says inherited variation, H says a static environment, and J says a long lifespan. Try it out, mark an option, or sorry, pick an option, and then we'll move on to the next slide. So the age-old question that everybody asks is, does evolution mean we came from monkeys? And the answer is no, right? Humans, monkeys, and other organisms will have similar DNA and traits because we share a recent common ancestor, which means in that branching of speciation since the start of time and then since the start of life, there's been multiple branching incidents, right? It just so happens that the branching that separates us and monkeys happened more recently than the branching between us and turtles, right? So that's why we're more similar to them. It doesn't mean that we came from monkeys, though. There just was another species that existed before monkeys, before humans, that was a totally different animal. And eventually, that population became more and more different, and one of them branched into us humans, and one of them branched into monkeys. So as an evolution recap, I want to talk about the fact that we have the evidences, which is fossil record, biogeography, homologous structures, DNA similarities, and embryology. And the ways that evolution occurs, or the methods or mechanisms by which evolution occurs, are through natural selection, mutation, gene flow, or migration, bottleneck effect, founder's effect, and reproductive isolation. Let's do a problem together as practice. We always walk through one together using the rake method. So we're going to read and highlight parts of the questions that are important. We're going to be rephrasing what the question is actually asking you for. We're going to be pulling our background knowledge, or if you don't have too much background knowledge on this, you're going to look at the note sheet that I asked you to open at the very beginning. And then we're going to eliminate and choose the best answer based on our knowledge that we've pulled. So right here, I think this is kind of blocking our info. Let me see if I can move. It's not great. So it says 3 species of lizards of the genus, something is blocked for me, found on the Canary Islands, a chain of 7 volcanic islands off the west coast of Africa. Oh, it says Galotia. So they're the 3 species of the lizards of the genus Galotia found on the Canary Islands, a chain of 7 volcanic islands off the west coast of Africa. The easternmost island, Lanzarote, is the oldest, while the westernmost island, El Hierro, is the youngest. The distribution of lizard species is shown on the map below. So we're looking at kind of where these spotted Galotia galati are, Galotia stellini are for the kind of crisscross pattern, and the striped pattern for Galotia atlantica. And so we're seeing a lot of the striped ones over here, we're seeing a lot of the cross ones in the middle, and then we're seeing a lot of the dotted ones over on the left. And this kind of gives you an idea of what we're referring to when we talk about the Atlantic Ocean, Spain, Africa, and the archipelago. So the question is asking, which statement about the ancestry of the lizards from the genus Galotia is the best supported by this information? And they give you 4 different options. Okay, before we do that though, we do want to go ahead and clarify, what is the question actually asking? So it says, which statement about the ancestry of the lizards from the genus Galotia is best supported by this information? That's kind of a wordy way to say it, right? So it's just saying, looking at the map of new islands created by volcanoes, what do we know about the ancestors of these lizards? That's the more simple way to put it. Now, we are going to look up our relevant knowledge. We're going to look up what is the important information that we know. So we know that very similar species found on newly formed islands were likely to come from the same common ancestor on a nearby continent. So the closer it is, the more likely it is that they were able to travel over. So I'm going to ask that we go ahead and highlight. And when we look at the important information that they gave us, we have Canary Islands up here, volcanic islands, we have the distribution. And then we're able to cross out a bunch of the options that don't really make any sense, right? In A, it says the common ancestor of the lizards first colonized the island of El Hierro. And I want to say that's pretty far away. So it's probably not going to be first. So we're going to cross that out. B says the ancestors of each species came from different continents at different times. Well, we know that's not true because we know that the volcanoes the islands all formed kind of around the same time, and that these species were all moving around the same time too because it's new free land. In D, it says the ancestors of each species evolved in Spain and were brought to the islands at the same time. Now we know for a fact that that's not true because it takes different environments for them to become different species. So if they were all just in Spain, they would have just stayed the same species and stayed really similar. So we're eliminating all this nonsense. That leaves us with C. It says the common ancestors of the lizards probably came from Africa. Africa was the closest location to these newly formed islands, if we just look at the zoomed out map right here. And we can tell that over time they changed because they were on different islands, they were separated. It's not because they were changed originally when they were in Africa. Now we're going to have you do a couple on your own. It should take you about 10 minutes to run through these. I will have these obviously already set on student pace, so you should be able to work through these at your own speed. Again, you're going to be using the rake method. You should have read and highlight first, rephrase the question with asking what, find out your prior knowledge, or use the note sheet to help you with the prior knowledge you need to answer the questions, and then eliminate and cross out the answers before choosing the best one. You're going to go ahead and answer these 3 questions at your own pace. And then once you finish all of that, you're going to go ahead and do the exit ticket. I'll see you next week when I return. Hopefully you don't have too many questions on this. And if you need to, you can always pause and replay any of the parts of this video.